morning, and I'm pleased to note that, well, pleased is not the right word, many old friends and current participants in the UN Global Compact, but many names that I don't recognize. And so we are duty bound to tell you a little bit about UN Global Compact and see if we might entice you into our initiative. So the UN Global Compact Network UK is part of the world's largest responsible business initiative. And we are connecting UK companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. Next slide, please. At the very heart of the UN Global Compact are 10 principles that are drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. As such, they are truly universal principles, and they form a rock-solid foundation for any corporate sustainability policy, framework, or supplier code. You could go anywhere in the world and present these values as your own, and they will be recognized in whatever challenging market you might be working in as truly universal principles. That concept has been accepted by more than 10,000 companies around the world and another 3,500 non-business organizations that have made a public commitment to operationalizing these principles. Next slide, please. So that commitment, this is in fact, it's a three-parter. The CEO of your organization needs to write a letter to the Secretary General committing to operationalize the 10 principles through your organization, committing to reporting annually on your progress, and committing to support the wider UN development agenda. And the UN Global Compact and local networks like ours, there are 68 local networks around the world. Our role is to support the organizations that make this commitment to make it real. And we do a number of things to help with companies, to inspire, to enable, and to try to improve the operating environment for responsible business. So for example, just this morning, we sent a letter to the Prime Minister calling on him to ensure that the UK's recovery plans from COVID-19 are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. You can see more on that on Twitter. And so here are the Sustainable Development Goals. And that third commitment to support the wider UN development agenda, well, there it is. The wider agenda at the moment, the plan that the UN has for the planet through 2030 is codified in the Sustainable Development Goals, passed in 2015 by every member state of the UN. Every country in the world has signed on to this agenda. 17 goals, 169 targets to leave no one behind and bring us to a place of prosperity and peace and respect for human rights and the environment. We take it for granted a little bit on this webinar that you already have a passing familiarity with the goals, so I'm not going to say anything more about all 17 in the general, but if we go on to the next slide, I am going to say a little bit more about what's brought us here today, Goal 12, responsible consumption and production. And the full text of that goal is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Beneath that goal, as it is beneath all of the goals, there are a number of more specific targets. In total, there are 169 of these targets. And this is really where the rubber hits the road. It's not sufficient, in our view, for a company to just say, we're working on Goal 12. You can say that, all right, but beneath that, we really think it's important that you've given some thought to the detail and the specific targets and the indicators that are how we're going to really identify that we've made progress against this objective. Now here we're just flagging up selected targets from this goal that have a specific relevance in our view to business. Many of the other targets are perhaps a little more oriented towards other stakeholders and mostly government. So the key here, and what this goal is most closely associated with, is ideas around circular economy. And so we're talking about more efficient use of natural resources, reducing waste, and the sound management of all natural resources. Um, to elaborate on that further, we are delighted to have Mark Lancelott joining us from PA Consulting, an organization that is really widely and deservedly recognized for the fantastic work that they've been doing in the area of circular economy and Goal 12. And so without any further ado, I'm going to say next slide and welcome to Mark. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve, and good morning, everybody. So this is a brief introduction. So I'm Mark Lancelott. So I work for PA. We're just under 3,000 people, sort of innovation and transformation consultancy. Our mission statement is bringing in ingenuity to life to create a positive human future in a technology-driven world. And as well as, I suppose, the normal services you'd expect a consultancy to do, we've got a technology innovation capability of about 350 engineers and scientists and designers. So we kind of do kind of hands-on kind of commercialization of technology, design, production, and kind of scale up. And that was one of the reasons back in about 2015 that myself and a colleague got very interested in circular economy and sustainability as a topic that we were passionate about, thought would be increasingly relevant to our clients, and thought that we would have something to bring to the party on it. So as we've been part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and their Circular Economy 100 for the last 4 years. So working with other organisations, big and small, on this agenda to accelerate a transition to a circular economy. And we've been working with the UN Global Compact since, I think, late 2016 out of New York. So we supported them develop a series of disruptive technology briefs that are available through the Project Breakthrough platform. We also helped develop the Breakthrough Innovation Framework that was launched last year at Web Summit. And we're currently supporting the Young SDG Innovators Programme, both globally and in the UK and Denmark. So what I was going to do, I think I've got 7 slides to talk to, just talk a bit about the circular economy as a concept, but more importantly, what is it in practice, and talk through some practical examples of companies who are using it to create both commercial value as well as having kind of positive impact on the natural environment. And that's really important around how to kind of align those two outcomes, because that's when we get kind of scale impact. So we're going to move on to the next slide, please, Jess. So this picture is known as the butterfly diagram. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking through it because it's quite an important way to understand the circular economy. So just to kind of help you navigate this and to start off, so the circular economy is an alternative to the linear economy, which is largely what we live in at the moment, where we take things out of the ground, we make them, we use them, and we throw them away. The circular economy is an alternative to that, where we try and keep resources and products at their highest value for as long as possible. So we design things to be regenerative and restorative as far as possible. So the way this diagram works, it's a value chain from top to bottom down the middle. So you can see the kind of extractive industries at the top, going through manufacturing processes into providing services, and then use at the bottom. And the idea behind the circular economy is to keep things at their highest value for as long as possible. So we try to extend product life through maintenance. We look for reuse, secondary markets. We look to kind of refurbish and remanufacture things when they perhaps aren't working. And then as a last resort, we recycle. So where we can, looking on the right-hand side of this picture, when we can kind of use tighter loops, we are destroying less value. So recycling goes right back up to the top of the value chain. So we're destroying all that value that's kind of been created. So there is a key message here that, you know, the circular economy isn't about recycling, recycling is the second worst option after throwing things away. So the more we can do to keep things in use for longer, the better. Just the other part of this picture, just to kind of show it, so the blue is what we call technical products, so things we physically make, whereas the left-hand side is the biological cycle, so much more in the kind of agricultural and kind of food space, where we've got different kind of processes happening. If we move on to the next slide, just wanted to give you some kind of headline numbers around this. So the first set of numbers, you can move on, Jess. So at the moment in our global economy, only 5% of material value gets recovered. So if you think about all the economic activity that's happening, 95% of that material value gets thrown away. So from a kind of macroeconomic opportunity, there's a huge productivity, resource productivity opportunity here for companies to address. And that case is really the kind of underpinning of the circular economy, and it's why it talks about economy rather than perhaps sustainability. So clearly there are significant impacts and outcomes in terms of looking at kind of reducing waste and pollution and things getting into the natural environment, but it's trying to make the case on an economic basis to change how we make and use things. So that's first stat, and for me it's very powerful. If you work in commercial organisations, you think about the level of effort we put into efficiency programs, trying to kind of shave off fractions of a percent. And if we stand back and look at the economy, we can see that 95% of that material value has just been thrown away. So if we can think about restructuring what we do through different business models and ways of working, there's a big opportunity for us. The second set of numbers is this 1.8 trillion euros figures. So this was a piece of work that was done 3 or 4 years ago by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation when they first set out their vision and started kind of mobilising stakeholders for action. And this figure represents the net macroeconomic opportunity in Europe from the circular economy. So clearly, a significant number and significant opportunity. And if you look in the EU at the moment, the circular economy package of activity recognises this opportunity and is trying to kind of mobilise and accelerate this shift, given the economic opportunity that's there. And the third number or pair of numbers I'd like to talk about is this. So last year, again, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation did a study looking at the link between circular economy and climate change and getting to net zero. And the conclusion of that research, which you can read, is that getting to net zero is 55% about the switch to renewable energy, but 45% of it is about changing how we produce and how we consume, so SDG 12 and the circular economy. So whilst I think until recently the case for the circular economy has been a economic case and a natural capital biodiversity case, there is a very strong case around how it gets us to net zero and addressing kind of climate change. So those are kind of 3 headline numbers I want you to take away. If we move on, I just wanted to talk about this resolve framework. So this is one of the sort of more practical tools and kind of concepts to kind of think about where might there be opportunities to play in the circular economy. So you'll see on the left the kind of link to the kind of reuse, reduce, recycle concepts. But this is really looking at how can you find ways to kind of regenerate and look at ways of restoring health of ecosystems, recovering and returning resources. How can you share assets better? So some of you might be aware of things like cars are, I think, pre-COVID and lockdown, only used for 8% of their time. I think for most of you, if you go to your wardrobes, 50% of your clothes you won't have used in the last year. So how can you get more return on assets by kind of sharing them? Third category is around kind of optimizing, which is back to kind of the efficiency agenda. So how can I reduce waste, and maybe actually how can I think about waste in a different way and think about it as a byproduct, and then look for different ways that other people could perhaps use that byproduct and input into their processes, rather than thinking about it as waste as something that has to get thrown away. The looping concept was a little bit about the loops on the butterfly diagram. So where can I look to reuse, to remanufacture, to refurbish, and extend the value and use of products and components and materials. Then can I think about virtualizing, so dematerializing, and we've seen that happen for music and CDs in recent years. And then lastly, this idea around kind of exchanging. So can I create marketplaces that facilitate that trade between byproducts or kind of old products and get second use from them? So I wanted to put this here because this is quite a practical framework that you could use to think about where there might be opportunities for your business from the circular economy. If we move to the next slide. So here I just wanted to talk about the role of technologies and business models and kind of mindsets. So in many ways, moving to a circular approach is transformative. It affects how you do things in quite a fundamental way. And we see kind of a key role for technology to enable that. And over the last few years, it's been a kind of key part around helping organisations shift this way. So, for example, on the back of kind of blue ocean and the kind of single-use plastic issue, there's a lot of innovation happening around materials and how can we use biological materials or shift away from single-use plastics into being able to recover those, or being able to use kind of reuse, kind of refill models, very much enabled by some of those kind of material sciences and commercializing those at scale. We also see things like blockchain as being important enablers to help kind of track products through their life cycle. So from production through distribution, through first use, second use, third use. So people like Maersk, the shipping company, are creating product passports on the blockchain for new ships. So in 25, 30, 50 years, when they come to their end of life, there's a record of what they've been made from and what the kind of components and materials are, which can be a big challenge to deal with things end of life. We also see things like blockchain being linked to Internet of Things and kind of sensors. So I know a couple of startups, for example, who are using sort of tags and RFID threads that they put in textiles. So an individual garment will have a tag and have a digital identity on a platform, and then it can be tracked through its whole life, and it goes from kind of first use, second use, right to end of life. So these things don't always have to be a kind of big kind of asset, expensive scale. And just kind of moving down those, I think a lot of the interesting innovation that's happening at the moment is around the kind of collecting technologies, sorting, inspecting. So, the dirty end of the circular economy. So what happens to our stuff after we maybe have used it first, and how do you kind of create value from it? A lot of activity around kind of chemical recycling at the moment. So how to take waste products, waste plastics, and turn them into resources that can be used back into the manufacturing process, so they effectively can be treated as kind of virgin feedstock. Just moving to the kind of middle columns around business models. So again, a lot of innovation here around how to enable and deliver value in a number of ways. And I'll just talk a little bit about the kind of product as a service model, which I think is a real key enabler for the circular economy. So this is the idea, rather than selling a physical product to you, which then you use, it's moving to a model where I sell you a service or access to a product. And the reason that's so important is because it can align the kind of commercial incentives to design for longer life and recover value, which isn't there in a traditional model where you're selling product. You know, the commercial incentive in a product model is to design for obsolescence, because then I can sell you another thing and create value from it. Whereas if I retain some ownership over that asset, it's in my commercial interest to make that as long lasting as possible and to maximize the value in the kind of material and resources in it. So it's a really, really important business model, you know, with some differences and challenges that organizations can allow learning to use. And the last column on this, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's kind of changing the kind of mindset, how to think about how do I design out waste and pollution and think about it as a valuable byproduct. How can I keep things in use for as long as possible? But what I want to do is to kind of give some, talk briefly about some challenges and then give you some practical examples. So if we could move on again, Jess. So there's a lot of organisations, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, have been deploying and experimenting and trying to scale circular business models. It's not without its challenges, because these are new models. So in bigger organisations, we see structural challenges. So if you're organised in a particular way and try to introduce a circular model, they can be quite difficult to align different structures and incentives to do that. We see, secondly, that a lot of the value in the circular economy at the moment is post-sale, and most businesses don't have those relationships. So retail businesses will sell something and kind of wave goodbye to their customer, and they don't know what happens next to the product. So how to think about capturing some of that value is quite difficult to the practical level. Monetizing that value then, again, is a further challenge. So a lot of startups I talk to who have great business models that create positive impact on the environment, quite often create commercial advantage for another party down the value chain, and how they turn that into a revenue stream can be a challenge. So that's an area of interest and challenge, but also opportunity. And the last point on here, circularity is a economic property. It's property of an economy or a value chain. So if you're a single player within that, you need partners and need to collaborate in ways that create that full loop of circularity. So opening up those collaboration forms and relationships, again, is something that organisations need to do. So if you move on, I'm going to talk about some examples. So this slide, we've got some big brand names that you I'm sure will kind of recognise as examples of companies who are creating value from the circular economy. So Renault, the kind of car firm, so they have had for a number of years now a remanufacturing factory in Soisy-le-Roi outside Paris. So it takes back from the kind of aftermarket gearboxes and engines and other kind of components from cars, strips them down, inspects them, replaces some of the parts that don't work, puts a as new warranty on them, and sells them out into the market at a discount to new products. And that is their most profitable factory in their group and has been for a number of years. So it's shown to them, and that they are kind of leading player in this space, the value that can be had from kind of remanufacturing as a model. British Sugar, so creates and sells sugar beet. So they're an example of thinking about waste in a different way. So they've done a number of things, but in this example, they looked at the amount of soil that kind of comes in with beet, which they were treating as a waste, and they've now created a revenue stream and business model selling topsoil, and they are the leading provider of topsoil in the UK. Moving to Philips, again, kind of a leading pioneer in this space. So one of the areas that they've been pioneering is the kind of as a service model, so the kind of product as a service model. So for Schiphol Airport, they provide light as a service. So Schiphol pay per lux. And what that means practically is a service contract, putting in the kind of wiring and lighting infrastructure, managing the energy, looking at kind of patterns of demand, adjusting kind of light around it, which has kind of helped them provide a better service to Schiphol, but also incentivize them to put in kind of more durable products, think about how they're going to recover the value from it. So very much a kind of great example in that space, and they're kind of starting to look at how you do that in the consumer space as well. Nike Grind, so this picture here is a running shoe, kind of shredded and sorted. So those are kind of different kind of components. So they're doing a lot of innovation work at the moment to find different ways of using those raw materials and get them back to virgin status. So at the moment, they're kind of being used for kind of more secondary uses. So they're not quite at the level of quality to put them back into the manufacturing process. So that's the path they're on. And the last example here is Loop. So Loop is owned by TerraCycle, who you may have heard of. So they've created a platform where you can sort of reuse kind of containers. So I think the interesting thing about it is they've got a number of the kind of big brands on board. So the Nestle's, Unilever's, P&G. You get high quality containers with added functionality. So I think, for example, they do a Haagen-Dazs ice cream in a sort of steel container, which kind of keeps ice cream cold for I think 5 or 6 hours, so you can take it on a picnic. But they're kind of pioneering this model of trying to get us to kind of reuse packaging and move away from single-use packaging. And then just move on to the last slide. Just wanted to talk about some examples with kind of startups and innovators, and these are companies that we've been lucky enough to kind of work with over the last couple of years. Dunnet Bay Distillers is the first one. So Dunnet Bay, as you don't know, is right at the tip of Scotland, so about as far north as you could get. They sell gin in sort of big, fancy, heavy, expensive porcelain bottles, and both as a result of kind of customer feedback and a desire to do something that had a positive sustainability impact, they were interested in moving to a kind of a closed loop kind of refill model. So the solution that we kind of helped them put in place is a sort of refill pouch, which is what's on the picture here. So once you've bought your bottle for life, when that's empty, you kind of order a refill. It kind of comes in a pouch, saves money and environmental impact on the shipping, because you're not shipping kind of big heavy porcelain bottle. It's created a sort of direct to customer relationship. So from a business perspective, really interesting, really important. You use the pouch, you can fill up your bottle, and then with the empty pouch, you can kind of go and just put it directly into a post box, and it gets shipped back to Dunnet Bay. They batch it up, and when there's sufficient numbers, it goes to TerraCycle for sort of specialist recycling. So it's been a fantastic model for them. I think the hardest part of the project was negotiating with the post office to allow people to put a pouch in that had gin, so they're quite concerned about cross-contamination with letters, but that's been sorted out, and that's working. On the back of it, they've expanded into the US, and they're now rolling out this sort of refill model across the rest of their range. So it's very successful from a business perspective, and it shows how you know, there's solutions like this even for kind of relatively kind of small players. Second example is kind of eco booth. So Nick Marks, who's the kind of founder of eco booth, so he'd run a relatively successful events management company for some time. Was fed up with going to these kind of big exhibitions and conferences and seeing, after everyone goes away, all the kind of stands and promotion material getting trashed and skipped or burnt at the back of conference centres. That's what happens. It's a huge issue. So he has set up a sustainable events company. He uses kind of circular, kind of closed loop plastics. Has a fantastic proposition to brands and companies who want to demonstrate their sustainability credentials, and looks kind of quite different in an exhibition space. So this picture you can see is relatively small, was one we did for us. So we helped him set his company up, and then we became his first customer a couple of years ago. And this is made on a huge 3D printer that he has in his kind of factory, in made from plastic bags, yogurt cartons and toothbrushes primarily. He's kind of designed this stand. We used it 6 or 7 times, returned it to him, it got ground down again, and kind of created another stand. So a really fantastic business, and attracting a lot of kind of fast growth through that. And the last example here is Stuffster. So Stuffster is a re-commerce platform with an aim to recirculate products, and they're focused in on the kind of garments industry to start with. They did a pilot with John Lewis a couple of years ago, which was very successful in terms of the level of engagement and take up from some of their loyalty members. And I think in November last year they launched in the UK with Adidas as part of their Infinity Play, so their kind of loyalty club for Adidas. And the way it works is there's an app on a phone. You're a member of the kind of loyalty group. You go in to order some new trainers. It has your back orders and can prompt you and says, you've got some trainers you bought 2 or 3 years ago. They're probably at the end of their life now. You've got some socks and some sports things. I will give you, £20, whatever it is, off your purchase on the value of those. Click here, it comes off your order. Courier comes around and picks it up next day, or I think even the same day if it's in London. And then their business model is very much around realising the residual value in those goods, whether that's involving repairing or recycling or selling on to secondary marketplaces. And that's very much around, how do you generate value from and second use from goods? How do you add something to the customer relationship for these brands? How do you develop insight into buying patterns and triggers, and to inform kind of marketing activities, as well as then having this huge positive impact in terms of getting more use of resources, rather than requiring someone to go back and get those ingredients and go through the whole product and supply chain again. So those are the examples. I think that's all the kind of content I've got. I don't know how I've done on time, but very happy to take any questions that you may have.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. So yeah, open to questions. We've got a little bit of time now, so if you want to put them in the chat box, and we can kind of read them out to Mark if you've got any questions, or if you want to unmute yourself and go for it. We've got a question from Pamela, who says, how do you think with COVID-19 will recycling or reusing less doable? Pamela, maybe you want to be less doable. There we go. So Mark, do you think recycling and reusing will be less doable with everything that's kind of going on with COVID-19?
So it's an interesting question, and and it's one I think particularly for some of the kind of reuse and refill businesses that I know, they're very aware of, that does this kind of raise kind of hygiene questions. So clearly there are understanding how things like kind of cleaning and collecting happen has been an issue, particularly in the kind of consumer goods sector and food and beverage, which has been looking at kind of reuse models. So in some ways it's not new, but it's clearly important and got more visibility. So I think in those instances it's around having the appropriate facilities where you can do that and being able to communicate that to users. I think there's actually some opportunities here as well. So we've been doing some work looking at the future of vending, and there are ways if you can think about managing the supply chain and kind of cold chain in ways where actually you're kind of minimizing contact from production right through the distribution channel. So these kind of solutions and models are there and can, I guess, have added salience in a kind of COVID world. So I think it raises some questions. I think businesses need to think about it, but I think it's back to get back to basics in some ways and getting some of those things right that were always important.
Great, thanks, Mark. Hopefully
Yeah,
that answered your question, Pamela.
Yeah, thank you. I guess just to sort of expand a bit, I think from the business point of view, yes, businesses could put in steps to continue with these things, but I'm wondering sort of, I guess, more at the local level, so like individuals, like for example, Starbucks won't let you bring your own cups in anymore. So when Starbucks was open-ish before lockdown, and I'm thinking also things like charity shops, where we used to be able to bring our old used but clean clothes or toys to cancer research or wherever. Will they continue to take? I don't know. In the meantime, if they don't take them, then it will end up in landfill. I mean, there are only so many younger children, cousins, nephews, nieces that you have who would take, old plastic toys or old clothes. So yeah, it's just, my fear of contributing to landfill with my children's old clothes, but my fear that there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it is a real issue, and I think consumer perception is quite important. So I know probably about 9 months ago, one of the coffee chains that we were talking to, and they was way before COVID, they had spotted a huge spike in staff sickness, which was basically tied to people bringing back their coffee cups which weren't clean and giving them colds or whatever. So as I was saying, some of these issue isn't just about COVID. It's things that have existed before and maybe not addressed adequately, so they need to be, but as I think as you're leading, there's the consumer awareness is much higher now, so there are going to have to be solutions put in place, and there is a risk in the short term that people aren't going to avoid sort of second-hand goods because of these concerns.
We've got a few more questions in the chat, Mark, so maybe I'll just ask you them all at the same time and you can then kind of answer them together.
Okay.
So one question who said, when we switch to a virtual work matrix, do you have any insight into how much the carbon footprint would improve? One question about the Stuffster example. Alison's asking if you think there's potential friction with the charity sector. And third question, which is about the language used surrounding the Resolve framework. and sustainability, and whether you think that's kind of accessible to the everyday consumer. So I know there's quite a few questions there, but maybe you could kind of briefly answer some of those.
So I think on the first one around how virtual working's impacted carbon footprint. So there's been a few studies I've seen over the last probably 4 to 6 weeks. So clearly there has been a dip. One of the forecasts I've seen, it might be a little bit outdated now, given forecasts around lockdown, but it was showing I think a sort of 7 to 8% decrease on annual emissions, which is kind of in line of what we need to do for the kind of Paris Agreement. But then you think about it, well, we've had this huge change to kind of how we work, and it's only had a 7 to 8% impact. So there's a lot to do. So for me, it kind of opened up the kind of scale of what we need to do and how there's some fundamental changes. It's not as simple as just we all stop commuting in many ways. So I think that's a challenge. It shows the scale of the challenge for businesses, and it also highlights what impact we could have as individuals. So I know from hearing people like John Elkington from Valan's talk, he's been advocating for the last 12 months that the biggest impact we can have as consumers actually is about looking where our savings and pensions and investments are allocated, and reallocating those to sustainable incomes will have much bigger impact than not commuting or getting an electric car or whatever. So I think that's interesting. Second question around stuff. So is there potential friction with the charity sector? So stuff is set up as a B Corp. So John, who founded it, is very passionate around kind of creating impact. So there is potential friction there. I think what they would argue is that they're trying to do is to increase the kind of circulation of things. So rather than something sat in someone's wardrobe and donated after 3 or 4 years, if they can trigger and get that thing circulated faster, it improves the resource efficiency and reduces the kind of carbon and natural capital impact of producing another one. So I think that velocity would be the kind of argument that they're trying to address. But I recognise there's a tension there. And I think the last question, so around the Resolve framework, not accessible to the everyday consumer, absolutely. So it's a kind of business framework targeted at people who think about businesses and business models and operating models. What I would say, so some of the work that we've done with consumer goods companies, particularly around sustainability, if you go and ask consumers, do they care about sustainability? They say yes, absolutely. You then ask them what they mean by it, and it's actually a bit confusing. And then when you really look at what's the kind of practical impact on purchasing behaviour, I think there's a small segment of people who can afford to, who will pay more for sustainable products and goods, but the vast majority in practice don't yet. So the challenge or the trick is, how do you create a product or a service that is as compelling and as price competitive and then is more sustainable? And if you can do that, then you've got a very powerful differentiating proposition to consumers. And that's what we see happening is, there's this innovation to think about not just replacing what I do, but can I create a different or better experience or some added functionality that's more sustainable? And if I do that, that is how I kind of get traction on delivering sustainability. And there are ways of doing it. It's not necessarily easy, because it requires different ways of thinking about consumer needs and how I deliver them and what kind of products and services I wrap around it. But that's what I see kind of companies who are taking this seriously. That's what I see them doing.
Mark, that's been brilliant. Thank you so much. And I can see that we've got other comments and other questions still coming into the chat, but I'm conscious that we've got another part of the session to move on to. So, so maybe some people who kind of put their comments and questions, maybe you can kind of take that into the next part. And Mark, I don't know if you wanted to share any contact details or kind of anything that people could get in touch with you afterwards.
Yeah,
or maybe
happy
just
to. Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Mark. That was fantastic.